drugs. That was the main problem. And alcohol. Maybe my personality also. I'm not sure, but maybe nowadays I'd be classified as bipolar. Certainly some diagnosis of my personality would find me lacking in social skills. And maybe empathy. Autism, Asperger's, no matter. I was born in 1903, and I was perfect for the jazz age. I didn't like, or at least had no ability to make small talk with people. The only thing that interested me was my horn and the music that I could play. The inability to communicate with other humans could be hidden by alcohol and drugs. I'm not saying that they opened me up. If anything, it was the opposite. I really didn't give a fuck what anyone thought of me and created this, barrier that ensured that most people didn't want to even approach me. Well, first time I was arrested, I was only 17. Should I talk about this? You'll probably judge me because of what happened, but the whole incident ended up being a stepping stone to the next phase in my life. I don't fully understand my own personality. Does anyone? I was witnessed leading a girl of 5 into a car and locking the doors. She was screaming and banging on the car windows. 2 men on the opposite side of the road phoned the police. The girl was released and I was arrested. Lewd conduct. That's what it stated on my arrest sheet. No attention was paid to the fact that I was high. I'm talking fucking high. I guess when you have a reputation in the neighborhood of strange behavior, then nobody notices when you're spaced out. Yeah, I was arrested a few times during the rest of my life, but only for being drunk. Could I function without alcohol? I seriously doubt whether I could. The charges were dropped in the end. I didn't molest the girl. I don't think that was my intention. Who knows? As I mentioned, I was fucking high. Who was the girl? Where did she come from? Whose car was it? What the fuck was going on in my brain? That's all history now, and it also led to my parents sending me away to boarding school, the next phase of my life. Boarding school for me was just south of Chicago, and in driving distance of all the music that I desire to hear as much as possible. Jazz. In order to get to Chicago, of course, I did have to make friends for the first time in my life. Friends who had a car and loved jazz. School overall, though, was pretty difficult. I excelled at music and at sport and at absolutely nothing else. I started going to Chicago to visit the clubs and speakeasies where I could hear and study jazz music. I wasn't there just to listen and enjoy. No, I had to understand it. It's not about understanding the rhythm music or the technicality of the musicians. It's so much more. Jazz is a living organism, and when you witness a band playing perfect music, then every member of the band is joined in sharing the same blood, the same heart, the same brain. I was a regular at the infamous Friars Club, where jazz fans like myself would rub shoulders with Chicago gangsters, and Joan Crawford was starting out as a dancer. Sometimes I would sit in with the New Orleans Rhythm Kings. It just blows my mind, looking back and thinking about it now. You can't possibly understand, but to get that kind of training, to perform with guys who are geniuses in their field, who are the foundation of a new movement, it was the greatest thing that could happen to a guy who was just 17 years of age and learning their craft. The other guys, they would return to school at a time, that would ensure they wouldn't be breaking any rules. I couldn't do that. I couldn't leave while the music was still playing. I arrived back at school exhausted and miss all the classes of that day. I would often have alcohol and drugs on my person to help bring me back to life. It didn't take long before I was expelled from school, to the horror of my parents. The options were to either return home and face them, or head to Chicago and become a professional musician. It was an easy choice. All I wanted to do was perform jazz, to hear jazz, to be enveloped by jazz. I formed a band with some other musicians, and we called ourselves the Wolverines. We toured the country, we recorded records. We had a following, and my horn playing became known. My star was in ascendancy at the same time as Louis Armstrong. We were compared. I would play the gigs when we toured, lost in the music, of course. After the gig, I would take a seat with my drinks and drugs for company. Sometimes I'd have heard about a musician playing at another bar nearby, and I'd head there for the night and hear them play. There were nights that I took to the stage for our gig, and I hadn't slept. I hadn't stopped drinking or taking drugs for days. Always mellow and uncommunicative. You don't need sleep if all you want is music, no human interaction, okay? There were nights that a woman would approach me after the set we had played, and I'd be quietly drinking. We'd head back to my motel room and we'd get lost in sex. There were moments that I got lost in a woman and missed the next few gigs, not leaving my room for days. The band would be pissed. We quite often had been fired from the gig. Lost money. Eventually, they fired me from the band, but this was the catalyst that resulted in the Wolverines disbanding. Some of the guys formed a new band. Their drummer Vic headed back to his family home in San Francisco and invited me to come along. His brother George was a homosexual, and his baby brother Ralph was a jazz obsessive who immediately became my biggest fan. I was welcomed into the family by their mother as if I was another son. The first time in my life I had a family. I was amazed to discover that Vic was classically trained, and that, as well as the collection of jazz records next to the gramophone, was a large collection of classical records. The family would head to bed, and in the morning when they got up, I would still be next to the gramophone, cigarette in mouth, bourbon in hand, and listening to the same piece of music as when they went to bed. I couldn't just listen to music. I had to understand its very essence. One night George said that he was going to a party and would I like to come along. It was interesting as there were men dressed as women, there were men openly fucking one another, and there seemed to be drugs and alcohol scattered around every single surface. It was rather like listening to my music. I did my drugs and spent the night sipping continuously on bourbon, and I experienced the life of a homosexual without ever touching another man. It was fascinating. I spent most of my life looking through a drug-hazed window, watching other people live their lives. I was the unwitting heir to the birth and growth of the jazz world. The music, the alcohol, the drugs, the cigarettes. Sleep was a necessary evil that I kept to a minimum. I would find a new band to join and head out on tour. I'd get on the tour bus and leave one town after another, arriving in a town in a drunk and drugged stupor, perform the gigs that we were paid for, visit clubs to see other musicians, and sleep on the bus as we traveled to the next town. I never knew where we were or how long we were away, or whether I'd slept every night or once in a week. I would sometimes return to the family in San Francisco after 5 or 6 months, or other times after over 12 months. They would be horrified by my appearance, and I would just take my position next to the gramophone and spend night and day after night and day listening to classical music. The mother would place plates of food next to me that I would sometimes consume but mostly forgot about as I drank my bourbon. The kid brother, Ralph, would spend hours sitting next to me talking, and I enjoyed his company, even though I never realized when he went to bed. In 1931, I arrived in New York City to play some gigs in Manhattan. I was broke, but found a cheap room in Queens. It was an excruciatingly hot summer in the city. I never had any idea how much time was passing or what day it was. I guess I had no idea whether it was night or day. I was delirious. One night, as I stumbled into the club to start work, to play that night's gig, well, it appears that I was a little late. A little late by 3 or 4 hours. The bouncers grabbed me, roughed me up, and threw me out. Fuck. I was consumed by alcohol by this time. It was everything. It owned my body. But not alone. It was not alone in owning my body. Jazz also owned me. My brain never turned off from the music, and the alcohol sustained my body. Sleep and food were almost a thing of the past. I got back to my digs in Queens and collapsed on my bed. The music playing in my head was loud. It was so loud that I believed that my head would explode. I reached out to grab the bottle of bourbon that was always next to me and knocked it over. As the bottle landed on its side and the golden liquid began to pour from the unstoppered neck, the music stopped. I froze. I listened. No music. Scratching. There was a scratching noise. Scratch. I immediately knew what it was and was too terrified to move. I lay there for hours, listening to the scratching noise and the quiet murmuring of voices speaking Spanish. I can feel the sweat dripping slowly down my face. I can feel my hair clinging to my head. My body feels like it's glued to the bed by the amount of sweat pouring from my body. The voices get louder. They're getting more confident. I had to make a run for it. I got off the bed and rushed to the door. As I opened the door, I looked back at my bed and I can see the eyes of 2 Mexican men underneath it, and I know that they're pointing guns directly at me. I ran onto the street and I'm screaming to anyone who will listen that there are Mexicans under my bed. A man calmed me down and convinced me to return to my room to check it out. We're back in the room, and I hear the man say that there is nobody there. They're clever, though. They're in disguise. The Mexicans are still there, but only I can see past their camouflage. They both reached out to touch me, and I turned to face the man from the street. He was still talking, but I heard no words. His mouth was moving, and all I heard was jazz. Did his arms open up to embrace me? That's the last thing that I see before I die. A stranger opening his arms to me so that I can die in his arms and not on the floor. I'm 28 years old, and I have no money, no friends, no family, and now no body. The body was only ever truly sustained by drugs, cigarettes, alcohol, and jazz. I never really communicated with another human being during these 28 years, except with music. It was only ever music.